Roxo Media House.
All right, guys, it is Iron Skillet week. It is SMU week, one of our favorite weeks of the year, and this rivalry means something again. And so in order to get the other side's perspective, we are talking to Joseph Hoyt of the Dallas Morning News this morning. Joseph, it's awesome to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, definitely. Always good to talk with you, Melissa.
Well, Joseph is, I would say, the foremost expert not only on TCU football, but just on the TCU-SMU rivalry. You have been kind of boots on the ground over in Highland Park now for several years, and we're kind of one of the people that broke all the Rashee Rice stuff last year, has been following that story closely, and all of the post-Sonny Dykes moving over to TCU. You were the guy that seemed to have all of the information and definitely caught the feeling of people around SMU better than anybody else, and so we will certainly dive into that. But before we talk past, let's talk about SMU's team this season. Rhett Lashlee in his first job as a head coach, obviously spent time at SMU previously, has a great lineage as an offensive coordinator. What are the early returns on his performance so far this year and picking up kind of where Sonny Dykes left off?
Yeah, great question, because I think that was a big question heading into the season. And one thing that Rhett Lashlee has kind of said through the first few weeks was, hey, everything's new. So we're learning about this team. We're learning about him. We're learning about how he is as a head coach, and he's learning that too. I think kind of the early returns, though, this is kind of what maybe we would expect from a Rhett Lashlee offense, at least. They were taking a ton of deep shots. Tanner Mordecai is throwing it all over the yard. And there's really there's no fear when it comes to throwing it over the thing everywhere. If you kind of look at the game against Maryland, and they had some pretty good corners, but Rashee Rice was sometimes covered by two guys, one guy, it didn't matter. I mean, he had 20 targets that game. So it's clear that, my big question for the offense heading into this week is SMU a one-trick pony? No pun intended. But maybe that one trick is really, really good, and that would be thrown to Rashee Rice. I think they need to find a running game. And I think defensively, they've been a lot more stout than they were last year. But I think last game we saw what happens late in the game, in the fourth quarter, when against a really big, tough running back in Roman Hemby from Maryland. Eventually they got wore down last week. Maybe that's a byproduct of a fast offense, having to be on the field a lot. Maybe that's just, them kind of getting their footing under a new defense. I don't know, but I think that's kind of the big lessons learned so far through 3 weeks.
You might have been speaking to Gary Patterson there, talking about that fast offense, keeping the D on the field a little bit too long. But let's talk a little bit about that Maryland game. It looked like early on SMU was in a great position to win. A couple mistakes, self-inflicted wounds, and then, like you said, the defense just looked like it got worn down in the fourth quarter. Is that a sign of concern, or is that just a team that is replacing a lot of pieces going on the road against a Power 5 opponent and struggling late?
Yeah, no, I think Maryland's pretty good, first and foremost. And I think SMU played really well for about 3 quarters. And then I think just down the stretch, when they had no other option but to throw. And I think actually it's kind of funny, because when they were leading 27-20, they kind of had a chance. All right, let's kind of salt this one away. Let's kind of run it down. And they couldn't do that. They had a couple turnovers, in that game. And then on the flip side, when they had to throw the ball, they kind of struggled a little bit. And who did Tanner Mordecai target on both fourth downs late? Was Rashee Rice. And I think every single person in Maryland knew that that's exactly where it was going. So I think that there's definitely lessons to be learned from that game. I think a little bit the way they handled the run game at the end was a little bit concerning. And that, I think that they got worn down a little bit. And I think that's concerning specifically this week, because they just went to Maryland, had a late night, got back at 5 a.m., and then now they have to come home, play a very emotional game against a team that's coming off a bye. And I think that, maybe that fourth quarter might be the pivotal thing come Saturday.
I think for TCU fans, having TCU in the game against SMU in the fourth quarter would be kind of a nice change of pace. So it feels like those last two, they really had to claw back and had too much of a mountain to overcome in order to be able to crest it here late in the game. Let's talk about that offense. Obviously SMU's offense has not been the issue since the Sonny Dykes era began, and really even before that. You can go back to June Jones and they can put points on the board, right? So, but this is a very different SMU offense. Rashee Rice is a star, a leading receiver in the country when it comes to yards, and you mentioned his 20 targets on Saturday. But they lost some pieces in the run game. Tanner Mordecai, it's not his first year in the system. He's done this before, but how do you think he's evolved as a quarterback, and who else can they go to if TCU is able to at least contain, if not completely corral, Rashee Rice?
Yeah, I think honestly that has become a question, which is a testament to Rashee Rice. I kind of called him, he's got that DeAndre Hopkins of college football right now, where even if he's covered, he's uncovered. I mean, it'll probably take double coverage, to be honest with you. He's been that good. But I mean, that's possible. And I think to your point, they're going to have to find someone else to step up. I think Jordan Curley is really, really good. And then he got hurt with the shoulder, and we're still kind of finding out. And I'd imagine he doesn't play this game, which I think is a big question. So who's going to be that second receiver to step up? I think Moochie Dixon, transfer from Texas, he did that against Maryland late, and I think that he's going to maybe have a bigger role this week. Jake Bailey, another transfer from Rice, will have a lot of opportunity in the slot if he's healthy, but he's also been kind of battling injuries. Bo Corrales, I'm just saying transfer left and right. It's funny how college football has become
very different.
right. But Bo Corrales, transfer UNC, practiced this week, and there was a lot of optimism about him heading this year. Then he had a shoulder injury in the middle of fall camp. He's dealt with injuries his entire career, but if for some reason he's able to go, like, that would be someone to watch. But so they're going to need someone else to step up in the receiving game, and I think that they're going to need someone to really step up in the run game that's a difference maker. I think Trey Siggers has been above and beyond what they wanted, and I think he is such a good running back at getting 4 to 5 yards. But they do need kind of a change of pace, kind of home run hitter akin to what they did last year when Ulysses Bentley kind of had a great game against TCU. Obviously, Bentley's at Ole Miss now. The one name that everyone over here in Dallas keeps wondering is when it's going to happen is Kamar Wheaton, the transfer from Alabama. And he's got electric speed. He's building up. He's kind of looking like that running back one potential frame that, everyone thought when he was a 5-star running back at a Garland Lakeview Centennial. So if this is the game he really finds his footing and pops, I think SMU fans would be happy about that. And sorry, I'm kind of rambling, but then going back to Tanner Mordecai, I think Tanner is, we've always known he has a really good arm. Last year, there was just down the stretch, there was a couple decision-making things. Even against TCU, he had a fumble that was kind of like, oh, what are you doing, a little bit. I think his ability is very good. And I think that, he has found a receiver he really, really likes, and he has no problem throwing it to. One thing I'll give Tanner, he's fearless. Sometimes I think that fearlessness gets him into trouble. But if he can kind of hone that in and really harness that fear, he's a very dangerous quarterback.
Yeah, that gunslinger mentality can go both ways, and it can go both ways from play to play, not just game to game. You obviously, you're very familiar with Sonny Dykes' offense. You're very familiar, or somewhat familiar at least, with Joe Gillespie's defense, having covered Tulsa SMU in the past. You mentioned doubling Rashee Rice, and we haven't really seen TCU have to defend against a great player, an elite level player. I think that what Tarleton with Bo Allen and some of their giant receivers, they were pretty good. Colorado might be the worst team in the Power 5 this year. And so, just good Lord, they've been terrible. Do you expect to see some doubling, or do you think that TCU can roll those corners who have been pretty good so far, but have been susceptible to the big play, which is nothing new for a TCU defense?
Yeah, I think that's a great question heading into this, and I think we'll see. Kind of to your point, Joe Gillespie's defense is really good at taking away your big deep threat and kind of, doing the whole, bend but not break kind of thing. I mean, going back to Tulsa, I know Sonny Dykes was said that they gave him a lot of fits last year. Tulsa and SMU in the season finale, and so I think that's going to be a fascinating question. How do they handle Rashee Rice? Because I think Rashee Rice has kind of earned the right to be doubled all the time, barring someone else really, really stepping up. And I think that if maybe Moochie Dixon or Jake Bailey have success early on, that might be something that TCU cannot do. But I'm very curious to see how they handle Rashee Rice. And I think TCU does have some talented corners, as you mentioned. So I wouldn't be shocked to see them try to stick to their defense, in its natural state, and kind of say, hey, let's go one-on-one and see what happens. Maybe have a safety kind of looking over a little bit more attention than normal to that receiver spot. But that's a fascinating question in the matchup heading into this week. And maybe if Rashee Rice has a lot of success early on, how does TCU react to that?
Yeah, and I think the adjustments are something that TC fans have appreciated coming out of the half. Gary Patterson's defense was what it was, and he was not often willing to be flexible within that. And we saw SMU the last 2 seasons just carve up the Frogs with the deep ball. And again, it's talented wide receivers on the other side, and so it's to be expected. But I think that we've seen more willingness to be flexible out of Joe Gillespie early, but we also haven't seen an offensive test like TCU is going to face on Saturday, anything really close to it. Let's talk a little bit about the SMU defense. You mentioned that it's much improved. The defense has not ever been the strength of that program, but they've definitely recruited better, and there's probably more depth than there's been in the last few years. One thing that's kind of been talked about, on the TCU side is the linebackers, and TCU's running game is probably the strength of the team, but hasn't really needed to be used in that, in that regard so far. Do you think that the front seven for SMU can at least slow TCU down, or do you expect to see big games by the TCU running backs?
Yeah, no, I think that there's potential for big games from TCU's running backs. And I say that because what we saw in the fourth quarter against Maryland. And I think if you go back and watch the Maryland game, the SMU run defense was really, really good for a while. They had a game plan. And the other thing too, is their game plan entering Maryland was, we're not going to let these talented receivers until Talia Tagovailoa beat us. We're going to force them to run the ball. It just so happens that when you force Maryland to run the ball, that they have a 220-pound battering ram in Roman Hemby that eventually would just wear you down if you kind of let that happen over and over again. So I think, we talked with, defensive coordinator Scott Simons yesterday, and he said there were a couple of big play calls that he wishes he had back. And he said that there were some run fits late in the game that he wishes, some of those players would have back. But to your point, and to the TCU side's point, I think their linebackers are very talented. Isaac Slade-Matautia is a tackling machine. I mean, we saw how athletic he could be last year against Houston when he hurdled a guy that was pretty much standing up, which you don't really kind of see from inside the tackle box very often. And I think Jimmy Phillips is their leader on defense. He came back for another year, and I think those two guys are really, really good. I think that the big question defensively for them, though, is can they get to Max Duggan? And can they actually finish the play? Last week, they generated some pressure for the first time. They started dialing up a couple blitzes, which was kind of Scott Simon's calling card at Liberty. And while they did get there a lot, they didn't really finish as much as they would have liked. So I think if they can corral Max Duggan, and kind of actually finish and gets him with some sacks, I think that could be a pivotal X factor in this game defensively for SMU.
Kind of similar quarterback profiles too, with Talia Tagovailoa and Max Duggan too. Both, maybe accuracy isn't their strong suit, but super athletic guys that can make plays on the run, and they have a really good feel for the game. And so SMU playing Maryland last week might actually be a benefit, and having Max Duggan start over Chandler Morris when you have a lot more film on him could also definitely help the SMU defense. We're going to talk more about Rashee Rice because I can't get enough of this kid. Absolutely. I like love to hate him so much. Like, he's great, but I do want to talk about TCU's kind of version of that. And Quentin Johnston doesn't have the stats that Rice has yet, but certainly has the talent, and is being talked about as a potential first round pick this spring. If TCU is going to have to pay attention to Rashee Rice, you think SMU is going to be doing the same type of thing with Quentin Johnston?
I think there's a significant chance. I kind of think I think there's a chance of it. And I think it's another one of those, like, we'll see what happens kind of thing. I think coaches a lot of times are very willing to say, hey, we're going to dictate how things are played. Obviously there's special cases, and I think Rashee Rice and Quentin Johnson fall into that category. But I wouldn't be surprised to see them say, hey, we're going to try to make, we're going to try to do this, and let's see how you react, instead of, oh, shoot, you're doing this, let's react now and then figure it out later. I think one thing that I think where Joe Gillespie and Scott Simons might be similar is, and it is the Bill Belichickian kind of aspirational idea, but let's take away your best thing, or let's really isolate this and force you into a corner of doing this, whether that's keeping Max Duggan in the pocket this game and forcing you to beat him, with his arm and kind of running a drop 8, or it's, hey, we're going to double team Quentin Johnson, and then we're going to kind of blitz heavy, whatever it may be. I think that Quentin Johnson's got to be a factor into that.
Yeah,
he's to your point. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. When I was at Big 12 Media Day, there's a couple players that you kind of double take, and you're like, oh man, that's a specimen. And Quentin Johnson was one of them.
Quentin Johnson and that edge rusher at Texas Tech were the two that I just kept looking at. Like, are those humans? Like that
I
kid in
know.
college? Like, who looks like that at 20 years old? I have no idea. Yeah,
I know. Were you made in a lab? Like, I don't.
I mean,
don't get it.
seriously, right? But it's like you go back to TCU. Like O'Shawn Mathis looked like he should be the most elite pass rusher in the country, and hasn't really put up the stats. Sometimes looking the part doesn't get the job done. I'm going to be fascinated to see too, because I think one thing that was frustrating from the TCU side was not seeing Quentin Johnston involved enough the last 2 years. I mean, I think his career catches are like 40 something over the course of a 2-year career, and it looks like Sonny Dykes is kind of committed to making him a key piece of the offense. And like I said, TCU hasn't really been pressed this season. They haven't really been challenged. And so this is the game where, I think we expect to see a lot of Kendre Miller because he's got a lot of tread on the tires after the first 3 weeks of the season. And Quentin Johnson, if Max can kind of force the ball to QJ a little bit early and open things up for the other talented receivers that TCU has, because there's a question of maybe who's number 2 for them, but the talent is certainly there, and the depth at that position is certainly there. I want to talk about Rashee Rice and just kind of, that I think he gets a lot of credit for resparking the flames here. And then, Sonny Dykes came in and dumped gasoline on the fire when he switched sides of the Metroplex too. But I want to go back to last year at the end of that game. I can't remember if you made it over to the TCU press conference too, or if you were at the SMU press conference at the time, but that whole, the flag planting, the accusations of somebody hitting Jerry Kill with the helmet, what were your takeaways at the end of that game? And a lot of us kind of look back and think that was the beginning of the end of the coaching era at TCU for Gary Patterson, of when things started to unravel a little bit. What were your thoughts from the visiting media perspective?
Yeah, no, it's funny because I've been obviously looking back a lot this week, just at video and stuff like that. And, I actually, because I was just filming the celebration, and someone goes like, "Oh, here we go." And I'm like, in the press box, I'm like, "What?" And they like nudge me, and they like say, "Look to your left." And I move the camera, and you just see Rashee Rice just, and the flag was just moving so like methodically, but like nice. And it was just funny. And then you just, slowly jogging up. And I was actually on the field when Oklahoma and Texas played each other, when Baker Mayfield kind of was running around with the flag after the Red River game. And I actually got tackled behind by an Oklahoma player trying to celebrate with Baker Mayfield. So long story short, I have experience with flag planting. And I was like, "Oh my God." I'm like, "Who is that?" And then I'm like, "Oh my God, is that Rashee?" Like, you literally hear me in my video say it. And then, obviously that happens. I'm like, "Oh, okay, not that bad." And there was a little scuffle, but it moved on. And then you see a couple other SMU players grab the other flag, sprint back over, plant it again. Long story short, I was like, "Oh my gosh," I couldn't believe I don't know the right word for it, but the fact that Rashee, said what he said before the game. He did have a touchdown, even though it wasn't his best game last year. But then having the presence of mind, like, okay, I'm going to be the one now to go grab the flag and try and play it. It was mind blowing to me. But then it was crazy. I remember we're sitting there kind of in the press box, and we're writing, and then someone goes, "Yeah, Gary accused an SMU player of hitting or maybe, I don't know if it was after the game. Forgive me. I don't know if it was after the game or if it was the next day where there was the accusation."
It was in the press conference, I think, after the game, where he kind of brought that was the press conference that he sent Sonny Cumbie out to meet the media. We had never spoken to a assistant coach before, period. So that was really, that kind of set the tone. And then he came up and kind of didn't accuse it directly of, but kind of made a comment about Sonny Dykes and his players, and, something happening to Jerry Kill. And then it kind of built from there at I think the Tuesday press conference that week.
Yeah, and then it was crazy though, because I remember like once the accusation was made, we're kind of like looking back, and like it was like kind of like the Zapruder film where like I'm zooming in and cropping my angle and slowing it down. I'm like, "Oh, that's the moment where Jerry Kill gets kind of knocked over by some TCU players." And then I think it was maybe Zach Barnett. Someone else had another angle. And then even there was another video angle that came out, and it's like we're all looking at it and we're like, "Okay, we can't find any evidence of it." And then Tuesday rolls around, and SMU was expecting Gary to apologize. Instead, he doubled down and kept going. And I remember, because like I was obviously paying attention to that press conference, and I'm just like, "No way!" Like, because I was expecting, just that everyone was expecting an apology from over here. And so that's what I was expecting. So, I mean, that was crazy. I think to your point, it kind of felt like the beginning of the end a little bit. It felt like there was something unraveling objectively, a little bit off, off kilter a little bit. And obviously in hindsight, we now know that it was. So
yeah, it's amazing that of all things that SMU kind of started the you go back the year that TCU hired Francione, SMU was the only win that TCU had that season, the 1-10 season that preceded it, and then that kind of kicked off the events that eventually led to Gary Patterson taking over, and then back-to-back losses to SMU for the first time in his tenure kind of began the unraveling of the end. It's a very symbiotic book ending, I guess, to the most important era of TCU football history. It's quite weird. Speaking of new eras, so obviously Sonny Dykes is now on the other side of the Metroplex. It wasn't that long ago, and I saw this pop up on Twitter again. I had forgotten about it, that he was frying frog legs in an iron skillet, which one of the most epic troll, and that's what Sonny Dykes has brought to TCU. We'll see the results on the field because we don't know anything about what this is going to look like yet, but that openness, that spirit of fun, that willingness to kind of play along with the bigger picture of college football, I think is the biggest change that we've seen for TCU under Sonny Dykes. But you were on the ground when the announcement was made, when everything leading up, and I was shocked at the reactions of SMU fans. I mean, I knew they'd be upset. Anybody would in that position, but I think we were all very surprised just by the passion and the investment in the program, because that was still kind of a fresh build. What were your impressions of kind of that period of time when it started to look pretty obvious that he was going to be the guy leading up to the actual announcement that he was?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I think SMU fans were just objectively and generally very hurt, to be honest. And I think that there was a lot of emotion and frankly pain, because they looked at Sonny Dykes as the guy that had brought SMU back and was going to bring SMU back, that was going to take them eventually into a Power 5 conference, build something here. Maybe 20 years down the road, he'd have his statue, outside akin to Gary Patterson at TCU. And, the same, I think they saw the same path. And and I remember the day, the walk on the boulevard, before the Tulsa game, after the news had broke the night before that it was going to happen, because a lot of SMU fans, they had obviously heard the rumors, but they're like, until he goes, like, we're not going to believe it. And SMU had negotiated multiple times for a contract extension with Sonny. So there was like optimism. I know there was optimism from SMU side that like, okay, he's not going to actually, like, this is going to, until he's gone, we're not going to believe it. And then that night before the Tulsa game, that's when he was gone, even though he's still there. And I mean, I just remember talking to people on the boulevard before the game, because Texas Tech at one point was another possibility for Sonny Dykes, and coaches from SMU have clearly obviously gone other places. Chad Morris, went to Arkansas. And that was a little bit weird how that got handled too, in hindsight, and just in timing purposes. And so talking to SMU fans, they're like, if it would have been Texas Tech, we would have wished him well. We would have understood. We know Spike Dykes, obviously what he did at Tech. It would have made a lot of sense. But they're like, in their minds, to go to their rival, and in rivalries, I went to college obviously too, and like I think sometimes rivalries can mean more sometimes to one party than the other, depending on whoever it is. And I don't know if that's what TCU fans believe or SMU fans believe. Regardless, for SMU fans, it was like, you went to our rival, the one that like our bitter, hated, across the town rival, like directly. And it was an unprecedented move in modern era. And, I think that there was just frankly a lot of pain, because in Sonny Dykes, they saw the guy that was going to bring them to where they wanted to be. And now he's doing it down the street.
I remember watching, I think you tweeted out some videos too from that walk down the boulevards. And then I remember reading all that. And it was funny because TC fans were kind of mixed on the hire. When you looked around the landscape, I think a lot of people wanted Billy Napier just because he was new and fresh and exciting. But the fact that SMU's fans were so upset made the hire a little bit more exciting and enticing from the TCU side, because for so long TCU both programs were cheating just vociferously in the 80s, but only SMU was having success for it. And so I think they're like TCU cheated terribly and just like cheated terribly, like could not like turned all of that cheating into like 3 wins a season. I still don't understand it. Like if you're going to do it well. But SMU represented early on everything that TCU wanted to be. And then obviously when Gary Patterson came in, those two things switched, and SMU took 30 years to kind of dig out from the death penalty. And you're right, Sonny Dykes was the one that gave them hope. And then when TCU got the Big 12 invite and they made other invitations, and SMU was kind of kept to the outside, I think that's really fueled the fire. And then SMU wins back-to-back games. And now all of a sudden, it's you start seeing the little brother kind of comparisons being made, and the Dallas-Fort Worth thing, obviously such an important part in Texas too. I do want to talk a little bit just on realignment. There have been rumors that the Pac-12, if they expand, the SMU might be a category. I see a lot of SMU sweatshirts at the school that I teach at now, and it's really upsetting to me. It makes like SMU and Baylor, I'm like, why are you infiltrating Sacramento? It makes no sense. Stay away. But do you think that, whatever happens in the next 5 years of college football, is SMU well positioned, or do they need to continue to build on the success and the foundation that Sonny Dykes started in order to be attractive to one of those, whatever a Power 5 conference is in the future?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think there's a ton of optimism from SMU side that whenever the next wheel of realignment turns, whenever that starts, they are going to go to a Power 5 conference. I think the Pac-12, in my opinion, is the likely spot. I think a pairing of San Diego State and SMU would make a lot of sense for the Pac-12 that needs to get something out of realignment coming forward. I went to the University of Oregon, so I also have I see what the Pac-12 kind of has done, what's going on, and what kind of I think they need, frankly. And obviously you're in Sacramento, and so you kind of know from the West Coast too that getting into Dallas and the DFW, would be huge. Not only for having a big TV market, simply just to get into the market, those eyes there, but to also be able to recruit DFW, I think is something that Pac-12 teams would love to do, which they haven't really done that much aside from like Arizona State and Stanford getting the occasional standout offensive lineman or Andrew Luck. So I think that makes a ton of sense. I think the ACC possibly too, for similar reasons. So I think SMU, and I think they're in a good position, to be honest, because they are showing too that they can make the investments. SMU having money is not like a crazy concept, but they've got $100 million end zone complex that's going to be they kickstarted with 50 million, and then they're raising the other 50. Everything seems good there, and so that they're going to have an end zone complex. They're going to do upgrades to Ford Stadium. So I think if you kind of look at the track record of teams that have made the jump, even TCU going to the Big 12, it was kind of a combination of factors like TV markets and stuff like that, but it was also success on the field, and then it was the willingness to invest in your product, and maybe even from an SMU perspective, maybe the willingness to kind of take a little bit of a hit early on to get into a conference like that. And I think SMU has the financials to do that if necessary. But yeah, if you look at Cincinnati, for example, too, you go to a college football playoff and then, and you're a contender like that and you're the darling. Same with UCF, same with, if you look at who the Big 12 got, they literally got all the group of 5 teams that had been kind of that Cinderella, over the years, and then BYU. So it's interesting. I think SMU believes that they're in a very good spot though.
Yeah, you talked about that end zone renovation too. I know that they put in kind of the little party paddocks a couple of years ago. I remember that when I was out there in 2018. The stadium's pretty small. I was surprised when I looked, and probably does need some level of investment. Is that part of that upgrade, or are there plans for a larger scale remodel, or are they just going to kind of do it end zone on up?
Yeah, so that's going to definitely increase their attendance limits, and I'm not sure exactly how much, to be honest with you, but it'll be a football designated office. There'll be workout facilities. The one thing if you ask SMU fans are not or SMU students specifically that they're not that happy about is it is going to eliminate the hilltop, where all the SMU students kind of are there. And I've always, objectively, as someone who didn't go to SMU, is from the West Coast, I always thought that was very cool, just seeing all the all the students on the lawn, especially even Lamar. They had 5,000 of them nearly out there, and it's a cool environment. So I think that's definitely one sacrifice that's being made that not everyone's thrilled about. But I think that adding a nice upgrade to the stadium is something that's a necessity, and I think it'll look really good in the eyes of potential presidents from other conferences that are going to vote on which teams they want to join their conference.
All right, well, let's get down to the nitty gritty here. So it's the third season in a row they've played. First trip to Dallas for TCU since 2018, and that rain-soaked monsoon of a game. It was such a blast to cover. Love being on the field, taking photos for that one. It's so much fun. How do you see Saturday morning, also a morning kickoff, which is also always an enjoyable thing? How do you see this game playing out? Who's got the early advantage? And if you're willing, throw a score prediction on us.
I can do that. I think it's a fascinating game. I think that if you look back at last year, how did SMU beat TCU? They ran all over the field and they dominated the line of scrimmage. To be honest with you, I'm not positive they'll be able to do that today or on Saturday. And I think that means that it's going to be kind of a game that's kind of decided maybe actually on the outsides. And we talked about Quinn Johnson and Rashee Rice. I mean, Rashee Rice, and I know we talked about him a lot, and I've now wrote about him a lot, but he's kind of deserving it. This offseason, he really committed himself to trying to be that next great SMU wide receiver. He's practiced like James Prochet did. He's lifting like, and no other SMU receiver has. And he got bulked up, and it just, he took such a jump this offseason, and we wondered how it would look, and it's looking honestly better than I thought. So I think that if SMU is it's not going to be decided on the line of scrimmage, at least from an SMU perspective. I don't think it might be. But I wonder how SMU, coming off a tough game against Maryland, traveling to the East Coast, getting back early and going up against a team that had a bye last week and a team that's very familiar with the personnel that SMU has, at least for the most part. I wonder how they're going to be able to handle the fourth quarter. And that's my big question. I think if SMU gets out early, which to be honest, I think they have the potential, they could be good and kind of hold back a TCU kind of race back. The other thing though, too, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. I think it's a fascinating game. The other thing too is I feel like we don't know much about TCU yet, to be honest with you. I mean, I think to your point, Colorado, not very good. Tarleton State is not going to give you answers, for a new regime. So I think that this is a big game to learn about TCU. And so with unknowns comes questions, but, I think we'll find out a lot about who TCU is this week. As for score prediction, I picked SMU in our and it's pick 'em, on Vegas, and I picked SMU. I think if SMU is going to do it, it's going to be kind of like I said, they start out kind of like they did last year, when Danny Gray had that big touchdown to kind of get them going. I think they'd have to get a couple big plays. Maybe they do it schematically and scheme open. I don't know if a trick play is coming. But I think that they'd have to get out early if they want to win. And if they do, it's going to be close. So score prediction, I'll go 31-28. SMU.
So a low scoring game for this version of the Iron Skillet.
Yeah, I know, right?
Probably, right?
Yeah, because everyone, I don't know. I just, even though SMU throws the ball a lot and has a fast offense, I think that, they haven't, I think the Maryland game 34-27 was kind of a good, kind of look at what a contested SMU game can look like from a score perspective against a good offense. Yeah, I'm curious to hear your prediction as well.
Everything that you said is exactly, I think, we have no idea who TCU is under Sonny Dykes yet. And this is the game, if TCU jumps out 3-0 with the way college football has been going, there's a good likelihood they enter into a showdown with Oklahoma as a ranked team. Yep. And I think, for TCU, it's a point of pride too. Like if you lose 3 games in a row to SMU, that's hard to recover from. That's following you around. And that would also mean that this entire senior class will have never beaten TCU or SMU in their entire time at TCU. So, which I think also would be a big kind of that's a big red mark on your tenure as a Horned Frog if you have 0 victories over the Mustangs. So I think SMU is going to get out quickly. I think I for sure expect a trick play that leads to a big touchdown to get TCU on their heels early. I think the Frogs are going to be able to climb back in this one. I think this is kind of the Kendre Miller game. If Max does 80% of what he did against Tarleton, which might still be a big ask because it is Tarleton. But if he looks that confident and that in control, I mean, he's going to have a huge game on Saturday. I think he can definitely take advantage of the secondary at SMU, and I think he can run for some things. So I think it's going to be like 37-34 TCU, and it's going to take some late heroics to overcome it. But that also might just be that I'm a TCU alum and I can't stomach the thought of having lost to SMU 3 times in a row. And again, thank God I'm out here at least, so I won't have to deal with it as regularly. But I think that this is the time when Sonny has to establish himself. And I think this game is going to mean a lot to him and his team, obviously, just like it will on the SMU side. But he knows he's got something to prove. And so I think TC is going to come out really ready, and we're going to learn if this team really is who we think they can be, which is, potentially a top half team in the Big 12, or maybe even a dark horse with the chaos that's been happening in that conference. So you're right, though. It's going to be a blast. It's going to be fascinating. I really wish it had a better window, because I think this is one people are going to want to watch too.
I agree completely. 2 extra little notes. I think this will be the biggest crowd, I think, in Ford Stadium history, obviously because of TCU, and there's a lot of interest. I mean, tickets are going for about $250 a pop now. The ones that are
TCU
left.
Students were lined up at 5 a.m. for the student tickets, which is awesome.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be a great environment. And then if SMU, if this is the game Kamara Wheaton pops, I think that SMU fans would like that a lot. But we'll see.
It's going to be fun. Where can people be following your work and hear all of your great perspective from the SMU side?
Yeah, follow me on Twitter at Joe J Hoyt, Hoyt. And then I'm Joe J or Joe Hoyt DM. My Instagram, I gotta step up for my professional one. And then and just follow me. I mean, if you consider subscribing, I think I write pretty good stuff. And if you want to know more about SMU, I'm always happy to answer questions on Twitter or email. So
support local journalism, subscribe to the Star Telegram and the Dallas Morning News. Always an important thing for us to be doing. Really appreciate your time. Looking forward to a fun game. I'm sure there'll be lots of interactions across social media here Saturday morning for sure. Thanks so much, Joseph. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melissa.